It's that time of year where every single player that's getting drafted late is getting labeled as a sleeper pick for one reason or another, but sometimes players receive unwarranted hype, and those picks might just end up on waiver wires in just a few weeks. So I want to save you guys from making less than ideal picks and point you in a better direction instead. So we'll start off with the first sleeper who is just not worth the hype this year that you should not draft, and that's Ausyin Ekeler, now acting as the RB2 or RB1B for the Washington Commanders. The reason why you shouldn't draft him is because he just wasn't that good last year, and I don't expect him to be any better this year on a new team. In 14 games played last year, Ekeler averaged 85 yards and 0.5 touchdowns per game on 16 total touches per game. That is a 17-game pace of over 1,300 total yards, 7 total touchdowns on 280 touches. That is horribly inefficient, averaging 3.5 yards per carry, 8.5 yards per reception, and because of that, he only averaged 13 fantasy points per game as the RB21 overall. What really saved his fantasy performances were touchdowns and massive target numbers. In fact, out of 14 games played, he either scored over 20 PPR points thanks to either scoring twice or seeing 7+ targets in those games, or he scored under 12 PPR points. There was no in-between for Ausyin Ekeler last year, and that is while playing 65 to 75% of snaps in a fairly mediocre offense. So now in Washington, he is not the best running back on the team. Brian Robinson is, so I expect Ekeler to take a backseat in snaps and touches, and I don't expect him to be averaging 5.5 targets per game like he did last year because of playing fewer snaps, and also Jaden Daniels is a mobile quarterback who can scramble rather than check it down. Not to mention that Brian Robinson is also just a very capable receiver himself, so Ekeler might just be playing the Antonio Gibson role as a receiving-only handcuff running back who, if you're lucky, might get you like 8 to 10 fantasy points some weeks. That's just not a player that I want on my team because I might get tricked into playing him more than I actually should, and he could wind up losing me weeks because of it. From ESPN and Yahoo ADP, he's around the RB35-ish overall, but there are way better running backs with way more upside going around him with guys like Javonte Williams, Tony Pollard, and Tyjae Spears, Zach Moss, Devin Singletary, Jerome Ford, Gus Edwards, and Blake Corum. I just do not want Ausyin Ekeler on any of my rosters and do not want to draft him in August right now when I might just be dropping him for a better running back by week 4. I will also include Nick Chubb here too, just because the injury last year seemed so devastating, and we know that even if running backs return a year after a huge knee injury, they're never really the same, especially when that running back is currently 28, turning 29 before the end of the year. We've seen how quickly things can fall apart for running backs as they age out or add injuries to that age. Take a look at guys like Todd Gurley, Leonard Fournette, Kareem Hunt, Dalvin Cook, Ezekiel Elliott, just numerous examples of father time beating out these really good but older and aging out running backs. So again, like Ausyin Ekeler, I would be passing on Nick Chubb for all the guys that I listed above because they all are not coming off of major knee injuries and should offer way more upside or just offer actual startable weeks because they are healthy. I think that is way better for the 2024 season rather than drafting Nick Chubb and hoping that he returns to form. Now, before we move on, I wanted to let y'all know to head over to 4for4.com and sign up for a subscription today to gain access to the industry's best fantasy rankings from award-winning ranker for accuracy, John Paulson. Plus, you get access to our live draft assistant, cheat sheets, trade calculator, articles, and there are additional packages for DFS and betting content too. Make sure to use the code YouTube at checkout to receive 25% off your annual subscription today. All right, the next sleeper candidate to bypass in your drafts is Saints wide receiver Rashid Shaheed. And I get the argument here. He's the wide receiver 2 with no competition for that role in New Orleans. He's a young, fast, big play receiver who could have a breakout third year 2024 season. But here's the issue with Rashid Shaheed. He is the literal definition of a boom-bust wide receiver because the only way he wins for fantasy is with big play touchdowns. Last year, in 15 games played, Shaheed finished as a top 24 wide receiver 5 times. Those 5 games were also coincidentally the only games that he scored double-digit fantasy points, 4 of which were over 18 fantasy points. The other 10 games, though, all wide receiver 45 or worse. And actually 9 of those 10 were wide receiver 52 or worse. So Shaheed was only startable in 30% of his games played last year, and you never really knew when to actually play him. So if you started him 8 times last year as your flex, chances are you started him on his bad weeks more than the handful of times he actually produced. And the reason for this roller coaster of a season is just all target related. He saw 5 or fewer targets in 9 of his games played. The other 6 games he saw anywhere between 6 to 9 targets and was a top 24 wide receiver in 3 of those games. So the hope for 2024 is that his targets go up and become more consistent, thus his fantasy production becomes more consistent, and maybe he's a solid wide receiver 3 or wide receiver 2 at best with big play ability. The problem though is that this team is basically a carbon copy of itself from last year, only really missing Michael Thomas, who himself missed half the season anyway last year. Chris Olave is still the alpha wide receiver 1, Alvin Kamara is still going to be the target hog out of the backfield, Juwan Johnson, Taysom Hill are still going to get targets, A.T. Perry can take a year 2 step just like Shaheed did last year, Kendre Miller could get more involved out of the backfield, and it is still Derek Carr at quarterback who is going to struggle to make multiple fantasy options viable on a weekly basis. My prediction is that Shaheed is still going to be a completely volatile fantasy player that you never really know when to start, and he was probably going to end up hurting you more than helping you. In his ADP range, I would much rather take a dart throw on Brian Thomas Jr., Mike Williams, who is also a team wide receiver 2, but for Aaron Rodgers, Brandon Cooks, another team wide receiver 2, but for Dak Prescott. And then there's also Curtis Samuel, Jalen Polk, and Josh Palmer, all of whom have opportunities to be their team's wide receiver 1, especially Curtis Samuel catching passes from Josh Allen. I would rather go down swinging with one of them on what I believe to be a much better option for weekly consistency, while they all have relatively the same floor as just being a Hail Mary flex play, just like Rashid Shaheed. And the last player on this list, I slightly alluded to it just a few seconds ago, but I am not in love with Ladd McConkey as the highest drafted receiver for the LA Chargers. I understand it, but I also just don't think Ladd McConkey is really even that good of a wide receiver, or at least not good enough to lead a team's receiving room. Now, I've been adamantly out on Ladd McConkey since the beginning of the year when the 2024 draft season started. It is all over the place on the DLF YouTube channel and my Twitter account, but to put it plain and simple, I cannot expect a wide receiver to produce in the NFL if he did not produce in college, and Ladd McConkey just simply did not produce in college. To start throwing some rookie analytics at you, McConkey does not have a breakout age, which means he did not have a single season over 20% dominator rating, let alone the more elite threshold of 30% dominator. Since 2001, only 8 other rookie wide receivers were drafted in the first 2 rounds who did not have a breakout age, and only one of them has ever produced a single top 24 season, which was Jalen Waddle. McConkey has also never posted a season with over 2 yards per team pass attempt. Again, another very important threshold and metric to quantify and standardize college production that he fails to meet. Since 2001, 16 wide receivers were drafted in the first 2 rounds who did not have a season over 2 yards per team pass attempt, and only 2 have ever produced a single top 24 season, which was Jalen Waddle again, and DK Metcalf. We have seen Georgia throw for over 4,000 passing yards in each of the last 2 years, and McConkey has never eclipsed or paced to eclipse 850 receiving yards in a single season. And you might say, well, that's because he's competing with Brock Bowers, to which I say, exactly. He was outproduced by an NFL caliber talent in college. What do you expect is going to happen when he's on an NFL team with NFL caliber talents all around him at wide receiver? That is the exact same thing that happened to Mecole Hardman, also out of Georgia with absolutely zero production. He was drafted in round 2 to the Kansas City Chiefs with Patrick Mahomes, but couldn't even make a mark on the team over Sammy Watkins or Demarcus Robinson, let alone Tyreek Hill and Travis Kelce. And while no, the Chargers currently don't have anyone near the level of Tyreek or Kelce or Brock Bowers on their team, so I understand why people have gravitated towards McConkey as the potential wide receiver 1 on the team, but my chips are on Josh Palmer to lead the team in targets, and this is all even assuming that the Chargers don't just run the ball 500 times this year, which is also extremely likely because of Harbaugh and Roman's philosophies, and we may just not end up wanting any wide receiver on the Chargers this year. The whole team might just be really bad. And the crazy part about McConkey is the other receivers in his ADP range. I would much rather have Christian Watson, Jackson Smith-Njigba, Hollywood Brown, Jordan Addison, and Jameson Williams as veterans, and he's not even the best rookie receiver in his ADP range either. Xavier Worthy is a way better upside pick. as is Keon Coleman as the potential wide receiver 1 for Josh Allen. Brian Thomas Jr. could be the 1B for the Jaguars as the new Calvin Ridley replacement. And even though Rome Odunze is starting as the wide receiver 3 in Chicago, he is also infinitely more talented than Ladd McConkey, and it's not like Keenan Allen has never been hurt before, which could pave the way for Odunze to have more targets. I just don't get why you would ever pick Ladd McConkey in this range when so many other players offer the same floor, but infinitely more upside with better opportunities and or playing in better offenses entirely. Now, if you're looking for more sleepers that I actually love drafting late in your drafts, I just made that video a few days ago, which you guys can check out right up here.